Thank you so much, dear Jan, for this comprehensive introduction. Also reminding us that actually our collaboration, the connection between University of Vienna and University of Granada really goes back many years, actually maybe longer than some of you younger generation colleagues here have been active. Let's say about 1996, 1997, this is when we started our work together. And it's been a great privilege for me to be associated with colleagues like starting with Ángela Collado Saiz and Macarena and Jan and then Jesus and Elizabeth and Mabel, and I hope I'm not forgetting too many dear colleagues, and Martin. And so wonderful to be here. It really feels like home. And I should really start my talk with the same apology that I have been giving so many times. Apologies for not being able to do this talk in one of my favorite languages, which is Spanish. I have an understanding of Spanish. As a conference interpreter, Spanish is my C language, but unfortunately I don't feel fluent and proficient enough to give a spontaneous improvised talk in Spanish. We have a question?
Yeah, excuse me. Well, my friends from the booth are telling me they can't hear you quite all right. If you could speak a bit louder.
Okay.
Or make the microphone louder.
I will try to bring this closer. Let's see, is this better? And yeah, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, testing. Okay. And another thank you for your initiative, and apologies again. Second apologies, I should have made sure that the interpreters can hear me well, but you have tested this before. Sorry, I kept too much distance from the microphone. Okay, where were we? Yes, the other big apology, unfortunately, I cannot do this in Spanish. I wish, but maybe if I keep coming back someday, escucharán una presentación en español entero. Okay, the talk that I am giving is both old and new. Old in the sense that the coordinators of the course have asked me to not talk about anything of the various research topics that, as you have heard, I have been working with, but to talk about the analysis, the description of professional conference interpreting, because this is what many of you will be doing for your thesis project in this master's course. So this stays the same. This was basically my assignment, and I'm going to give you that, and that focuses on the theoretical framework of functional translation theory, describing a conference in a multi-level analytical framework, as I like to call it. And so you have possibly heard about that, and you may also have seen the recorded version of the Zoom talk that we did about this topic 3 years ago. So this is the core of this stays the same. Okay, the core of it is the same because my mission here, my task has remained the same. So you will not be surprised to hear that I have not changed my theoretical orientation or background, but I'm still believing that this approach that I have been adopting myself and presenting here is still useful and is worth sharing with you as master students. But what about the new part? The new part may be interesting. It just so happens that in this week, Macarena Prados, one of my dear colleagues here, have been organizing a workshop of specialists in translation and interpreting studies, mainly translation studies, under the heading of Translation in Context, or Contexts in Translation. And this is a researchers' meeting discussing recent research, presenting new ideas to each other, and the result of this workshop will be published in the form of a book. And I am also happy to be part of this workshop and to be contributing to this workshop. And since the workshop is entitled Translation and Context, when this invitation came about to do this talk, I thought, well, maybe we could focus on this notion, which is a new idea, we haven't done this before, and sort of reorient this descriptive framework for conference interpreting by foregrounding the notion of context, asking ourselves, what is context? Can we use the notion of context? You've heard about the hypertext. Embarrassingly enough, yeah, that is a notion that I proposed and that seems to have stayed and is being referred to. But what about context? And if we do this, if we combine this ongoing research with teaching, it's actually a nice epitome of the original idea of a university and an academic course, which is research-based teaching. What we teach to our students, to the next generation of graduates, should actually be based in scholarship, in research. And so I'm trying to share with you some of the ideas that I developed with reference to context for this workshop that we're doing here this week, and build this into what you may have heard before. So that's the idea, with a little bit of innovation. In terms of the outline, I'll focus on context and share with you a few assumptions of why I think the notion of context may be of interest. And then it will be important, as in any academic piece of work that we do, to have a definition. What is context? And we will discover that it is not at all easy to get a grip on this slippery concept of context, because context can be, well, this is maybe revealing too much, too early, but context can be anything. We use context very liberally. Anything is context, and so we need to think about how to define a term, otherwise we cannot really work with it in an academic paper. Okay? And then I'll actually share with you an example, just for illustration. I won't give away what this is. And then we will head toward more familiar waters, and I will review the multi-level analytical and descriptive framework that you may know from my 1994 book that has kindly been referred to by Jan. And but we will try to think of this framework then when we return to the example that I'd like to share with you. So I'm not presenting a thesis project, a trabajo fin de Máster with you, but approaching it. I'm giving you a taste of an authentic interpreting assignment and trying to suggest that this practical example and my theoretical framework can go together, can be combined. Kind of a modeling what you will be expected to do, and we can have a little discussion of what we can do with it for context. And mainly I hope that you will stay awake during this talk and make notes of issues that seem unclear or points that you would like me to elaborate on, so that we can use the time together to have a discussion and answer questions that you would like to raise. I would be very happy. The more questions, the better. And it is, after all, a privilege to be able to do this on site together, to look in at each other and see reactions and facial expressions. As we said 3 years ago, we had to do this on Zoom. It can be done, but there's nothing better than live human communication. So let's have a lot of live human interaction at the end of the talk. Okay, what are my basic assumptions? It's obvious that we talk about context a lot. Like when you are asked, how would you translate that? How would you render this sentence? What's the best response? By a teacher or by a fellow student? Best response is probably, well, it depends. What does it depend on? Depends on the context. Where you say, translate this sentence, in what context? Where did this come up? So what's the context? I think we use context a lot, and for a good reason, because translation happens in a context. And we take this for granted so much that we don't think too much about the notion of context. We just refer to context a lot. So in translation studies, we have a lot of reference to the notion of context, but very little academic analysis. Very little definition. What do we mean when we say context? Or what can we mean? What can we refer to? So that's a statement, that's a claim. And I will suggest that since context is so ubiquitous, it probably occurs in at many different levels. And we will try to see how these levels can be distinguished. I think we will be able to talk about micro context and macro context, even though I will not focus on these issues, but kind of a larger notion and a narrower sense of context. So we'll come to that. And one of my assumptions that I also propose in that workshop this week is that when we think about context in translation, it's quite different from the way we think about context, or we should think about context in interpreting. And what we will be doing this afternoon, this evening, is of course think about context in interpreting. My claim would be my assumption that in translation this is quite different, but maybe this is something that some of you who are also active in translation would like to discuss afterwards. The notion of context, as I will try to show, is also very much in line with the theoretical framework of Skopos theory, or of functional translation theory. But I've just heard from Jan's introduction that it's actually in your course, there's not that much theory that's taught to you, so I'm not quite sure to what extent I can assume that you all know what I'm talking about when I talk about Skopos theory. Maybe some of you can give me a little nod or a shake of the head whether Skopos theory, functionalist translation theory, is familiar. You've read about it, you heard it? Yes, good. So we're on the same page, as they say. And I would claim that if we think and work in a functionalist theoretical framework, the notion of context can naturally be built into that, even though it just so happens that it hasn't been foregrounded by scholars like Christiane Nord and Hans Vermeer and Katharina Reis. But I'll show some examples that their work and their terms can easily be linked up with the notion of context. And as I've already said, different types of context, and in our approach to describing professional conference interpreting, we will, I would suggest, do well in focusing on situational context, the notion of situational context. Situation not only as describing what happens where and when, but describing the situation by taking a socio-cognitive approach. And we can discuss what that means. And in fact, the model that you know and the model that I'm proposing can be characterized as a socio-cognitive approach to translation and interpreting analysis, which means the situation not objectively described, but the situation as it is perceived by those involved in the communicative event. Okay, let's approach context. One way of approaching context, and I've lifted this from another publication, is to say at the heart of what we're doing as conference interpreters is the task. At the heart of it all is conference interpreting, doing it, right? And the task as such, rendering a speech from one language into another language, is performed by the agent or the actor by the interpreter. So that is, of course, the core of the activity of interpreting that we're talking about, and everything around it is the context. Everything around it is context. The agent is in a context and the task is done in a context. That's an acceptable approximation, but it's still very vague and general, that context is whatever is around or surrounds the task, or other scholars use the word embedded. Also Skopos theorists like Hans Vermeer liked to talk about embeddedness, that everything is embedded in a situation, everything is embedded in a context, and everything is embedded in a culture. So yes, the task performed by the interpreter is embedded in context. But let's see what this means more specifically. So if we try to define context, I'll take you back for a minute to ancient languages, to Latin. We know when we focus on just a part of the term, which is text, the etymology of that is very nice, because the Latin word textus actually suggests something that's woven together and linked up, and that's a beautiful image for the concept of a text. Whether it's written or spoken, a text is something where different strands hang together and cohere and are cohesive. So that much we know about text and textus. And contextus also goes back in the English language to the 14th, 15th century, when it was defined as a construction, a composition, and sometimes also the parts that come before or after what we're looking at. So the foregoing or the following, the subsequent parts, that is the meaning of context that has been around in the English language for centuries now, if we look it up in a dictionary of English etymology. And what is, if you look it up in a dictionary in general, maybe a dictionary of linguistics, you typically get two basic meanings. One of them is context means situational context. So context is closely related to the notion of situation, and you could also use the qualifier extra-linguistic context. So the task, the speeches, or the linguistic part, and context around it is extra-linguistic. So that's one basic understanding of the notion of context. And the other is also very important, and sometimes is confused, is the notion of linguistic context. So the more you approach the task of texts and languages from a linguistic point of view, you tend to view this more narrowly, perhaps because it's also interesting in the sense of the old etymology to think about what comes before the term I'm interested in and what comes afterwards. So this is the immediate linguistic context in which we find, for instance, a term, an expression, a phrase, whatever. So both meanings can be found, are commonly referred to in dictionaries, but this shows us that context is not one thing, but one main meaning, situational context, extra-linguistic, on the other hand, at the same time, linguistic. Context is something linguistic. One scholar whose name and work should be mentioned in this context, see, mentioned in this context, I'm using context very loosely myself, as we do in our languages very often. One person is Bronislaw Malinowski. Bronislaw Malinowski did research on, well, we might say, even though it's not politically correct, exotic cultures, unknown, unfamiliar cultures. And he studied, back then the terminology was even worse, and they said that they were studying savages, savage peoples. So I'm glad we have gotten away from that in anthropology and ethnography. And so studying different cultures, foreign cultures. And Malinowski said that, and I'll give you the quote in a second, that in order to understand a group of people, we need to understand what they say within the context of situation. The context of situation, and he also uses the notion context of culture. And I think it's quite appropriate that we recall this pioneering thought of Malinowski as an anthropologist, because this is exactly 100 years ago that he first proposed in one of his research publications this notion of the context of situation or context of culture. So let's celebrate a little bit the 100th anniversary of Malinowski's context of situation. Here is an interesting quotation, and he said, obviously, if you study a group of people, you want also to understand how they communicate, get access to their language. So the study of any language spoken by a people who live under conditions different from our own, and possess a different culture, must be carried out in conjunction with the study of their culture and of their environment. So the language is embedded in the culture, and this idea is probably very much familiar to you also from Scopus theory and the readings that you may have done on functionalist translation theory. And it's interesting that this idea of language being embedded in a culture or embedded in a context of situation and culture goes back to this scholar. I think we're relying on this pioneering work, at least for one sense in which we use the concept of context. And here is another one as well, equally important. So much for definition, for defining the notion of context. And this is, of course, very theoretical, and it'll get even more theoretical. And I'll now proceed to my example. And let's see what you can hear. I hope that the audio will also be understood or travel into the interpreting booths. If not, nothing much happens. It's just a very brief excerpt. Let's see whether it works. And I'm not even sure you have to interpret it, but this is a sample that I'd like to play for you. It's not playing. Oh, I think we need to... Can we increase the volume? Because it worked just a minute ago. Yeah. We'll try again. Maybe. It's playing, but you cannot hear it. Yeah. I think I've done something wrong here. Wait, I'll play it again.
The rapid pace of developments requires us to take a step back and assess the way in which we conduct activities in outer space, to make sure we remain competitive and to make sure that our citizens continue to reap the benefits from space services and applications.
Okay, and that would be a statement, an example of where I said, okay, translate that please, interpret that. But that's a statement, as we, I think, all agree, out of context. So maybe in the 60s, when people were still firm believers in the notion of linguistic equivalence, in the possibility of machine translation, as people nowadays do again, that translation is just a linguistic conversion, there should be no problem interpreting that. It's language, it's English, and you understand it. It has a slight accent, but you should be able to interpret that. And yet, I think we would feel uncomfortable. This is just a statement. There's no context. What is this? Where does it come from? And that's simply the reaction I wanted to illustrate. I'll do it again. I'll give you a little more, a larger stretch, part of it slightly expanded.
We have been an actor in space for a long time. We remain at the forefront of developments with a capable space industry, cutting-edge research, and the Space Center S-Range in the northern parts of Sweden. The rapid pace of developments requires us to take a step back and assess the way in which we conduct activities in outer space, to make sure we remain competitive and to make sure that our citizens continue to reap the benefits from space services and applications.
we're getting a little more, a little taste, and we can pick out some things and we can start making conjectures where this might come from, what this is all about, who this might be, where the speaker is from. So we can, as it were, construct the context inductively, right? It's not what we would ideally want to do, but what I'd like to stress here is how unnatural that would be if we focus on the task. This is a statement, this is a brief message, and go ahead and interpret it. And this is not how we usually work. And just to make sure that, no, we work the other way around. We approach things from the broader context and situation, and then we engage in our task. And I'll give you, just by way of illustration, so that you can continue your little guessing game at my example with the third little teaser.
Señor Presidente, Costa Rica apoya firmemente el proceso de establecimiento de directrices de sostenibilidad a largo plazo de las actividades espaciales. Consideramos que para que las futuras generaciones puedan disfrutar del espacio, es fundamental preservarlo exclusivamente con fines pacíficos.
Okay, so few snippets there from an event, a communicative event that involved different languages, conference interpreting, simultaneous interpreting, and we will return to this. I'll give you kind of the solution to this puzzle, what this is about and what this was, after we have presented the theoretical notions for analysis, and we'll try to then put together and look at our example in the light of that theoretical framework. Okay? So we need to analyze this kind of communication, and one way of starting out that was also referred to by a scholar of the functionalist school that I mentioned a few moments ago, namely Christiane Nord. I'm sure you know Christiane Nord's work because she also worked actively with Spanish, more actively than I, unfortunately, and published in Spanish, and her work is very accessible. And she also, back then in 1988, said we need to analyze what's going on in communication before we translate or interpret, and analyzing communication can be done, she's also suggested, by taking our point of departure in the so-called Lasswell formula. Lasswell was an American communication scholar, a political scientist, who coined this term, this short expression called the formula. Who is saying what, to whom, where, when, and for what purpose? That kind of, in a nutshell, summarizes the questions we should ask when we approach the task of analyzing communication or analyzing a communicative event. And here, of course, the notion of saying is relevant. What saying in what way, and communicating in what sense, in what context. So it's not just saying something monologically, but it's probably taken from some context of interaction, and we focus on this in interpreting. To go into more detail, we could build on a model that you may also have seen, that was designed for interpreting, analyzing, interpreting as interaction. This model dates back to the 1970s, and what I find interesting is that model of interaction in interpreting was in turn modeled on an earlier model of interaction in translation by another familiar name, namely Katharina Reis, the co-author of this book on Scopus theory from 1984. So Reis proposed the model in 1975. I will not bore you with that, but this is the model that Hella Kirchhoff, also working in Heidelberg, suggested. Those of you who have used my textbook will find this in the chapter on models, and it's a very old model, one of the first attempts to analyze interaction in interpreter-mediated communication in greater detail, and so we'll just revisit this briefly and have a look, because it already contains several useful notions before we then present the kind of analytical framework that I'm here proposing. So this looks a bit complicated for those who have never seen it. Is there anybody who has never seen this model in the room? Yes, thank you for your show of hands. Yes, thank you. So it's not all too familiar. So it looks complicated. I think we agree on that. Too many lines, too many boxes. So what's going on? How can this be interaction when it's just too many geometrical shapes? Let's look at it with some highlighting. What happens here from left to right? There is we could call it a speaker. Speaker number one. Actually, the original 1970s terminology sometimes also refers to a sender. A sender. This notion of sender and receiver, if I'm permitted to make this aside, is also interesting because it dates from a time where different theoretical frameworks in the field of communication were very much commonly accepted. That after 1949, the so-called mathematical theory of communication by Shannon and Weaver, people believed that communication should be analyzed as a code transmission procedure, where you have a sender encoding a message. The message then travels through a channel. Sometimes there is noise in the channel, but it travels through a channel and is then decoded by a receiver. This is pretty old model of communication by Shannon and Weaver, and that was very influential in the post-war, post-Second World War decades, because people really thought of language as a code and communication as something that is sent through a channel and it arrives unchanged on the other side. So this is a very mechanical concept of communication, and even though I do not wish to criticize Rice or Kirchhoff, obviously they were so familiar with this way of talking about communication that they actually use code and sender and receiver in describing this. Nowadays, I think we would want to get away from this terminology because it suggests something too mathematical or information theoretical, or information theoretical, mathematical, or mechanical. So there's, coming back to the model, there's this sender, let's call him a speaker, and creating a message, and that is first understood by receiver 2, let's say recipient 2 here, that's the interpreter, and the interpreter, functioning as a bridge, then becomes the sender in the target language, creating message 2, the target language message, that will then be received by the original intended receiver. So this is the interaction, the communicative chain from an original speaker to the original intended listener. And in fact, some models from the 1970s limit themselves to just that. They say this is interaction between a speaker and the listener mediated by an interpreter. And where I think this model goes far beyond what other people in the 1970s did is that Kirchhoff, building on the Rice, said, wait a minute, but there's more to that. There's not only the language, but this is set in a situation. So here we have the concept of situation. This is a situated activity. And again, to receive, understand the target message, that's also a situated activity. But there's more to that, of course, because the situation is found within a cultural context. Let's see, go back. A cultural context, as we said, the situation is embedded in a cultural context. And then this model also highlights that the sender and the receiver, or the speaker and the listener, share a have a shared communicative situation. And what I find intriguing in this model, and we can discuss the implications of that, is that Kirchhoff does not posit the interpreter as sharing this shared communicative situation. See, the interpreter is set separately from the shared communicative situation, the situation that the communicating parties are sharing. And I think this is worth discussing. If you read the paper, she actually says this is because the interpreter isn't really an interacting party. The interpreter is not an interactant, but it's just the interpreter making interaction possible. And I think this is where I would disagree with this old pioneering model, because nowadays, especially in light of more recent research on interpreting, we have come to accept the claim that interpreters are also interacting parties, and they intervene, they are active in the communicative situation. So picturing them as separate from the shared situation is a bit questionable. Maybe we could argue that, well, they sit in the back of the room in a booth, so they are not part of the space and the situation we're sharing. And this is one plausible explanation, but this is not what Kirchhoff intended, because she also talks about consecutive interpreting, where there's no booths. Her model is supposed to apply to consecutive as well as simultaneous interpreting. So she really claims that the interpreter is not involved actively in the interaction, which is, I think, interesting food for thought. But other than that, the situation is very rich because it includes the situation and the cultural context. Which brings us to another view of describing this embeddedness. And this is what I did for my own doctoral dissertation in the early 1990s, when I did exactly the same thing that you will be doing for your end of master's course thesis. My interest was in analyzing a professional assignment that I had done back then in California, a conference, German, English, political discussion, and there was a team of 3 interpreters, and we were struggling. We weren't quite clear why the conference, the interpreting had gone less than well, but we really felt we hadn't been able to do a good job. We were for some reason struggling, and so I thought, wow, how can this be? We've all been trained, these were experienced colleagues, and we all felt that this was a bit too difficult and we didn't do a good job. And I thought it would be, rather than just be frustrated and go home and have a glass of wine and then try to get over it, and said, what happened? I want to understand what happened. What was this conference like? What were the speakers doing? What was I doing? And actually there were recordings of that event, and that's how the idea for my doctoral dissertation arose. So I wanted to do a description of the professional assignment. This is exactly what you will be doing. For some reason then I settled on another conference a year later where I made recordings, and in order to then, I had all these cassette tapes. Some of you may still remember a medium called cassette tape where speeches were recorded. and I had this box of cassette tapes and thought, okay, now let's analyze the conference. How do you do that? Where do you start? And well, my doctoral supervisor said, well, you need a theoretical foundation. You can't just start describing and claiming and observing. And so the theoretical framework I was working with at the time was the Skokos theory, the functionalist theoretical framework. But also we talk about Vermeer and Skokos theory a lot, but the really interesting, the even more interesting and influential scholar was a Finnish colleague by the name of Justa Holtzmentari. I'm not sure that name is as familiar to you as, thank you for your, I love on-site communication, thank you. Justa Holtzmentari, it's a 2-part name, like Spanish names, like first part, second part, last name. Holz, like wood, is the term wood in German, Holz, and the strange Finnish name Mentari. Justa Holz-Mentari in 1984 wrote a very innovative dissertation in which she didn't focus on the translational aspects that Scopus theory focused on so much, but put the task of the translator in a broader sociological framework. And she said translation is something professional, and we don't just do it for fun, we do it for pay. We need an assignment, somebody needs to ask us and pay us to do our job. And so she said it all starts with the assignment, or with kind of a contract between somebody who needs something translated or interpreted and somebody else who can deliver the service. So a client and a service provider, as we say nowadays. The client of the interpreting job and we as interpreters providing that service. And I think that is a very useful starting point. It goes far beyond linguistics, looking at a text, looking at a clause or whatever, but it all starts with the professional assignment. And the interesting source to turn to there is really Justa Holz-Mentari. The great tragedy is that her work is innovative not only in terms of ideas but also in terms of German terminology. She uses words and terms that are innovative to get people away from the established assumptions and common thinking. But those newly coined German terms, the neologisms, proved so hard to get into English that they really never made it into the canon of research literature in the English language. And as you all know, English has become the lingua franca of many scientific fields, probably of all scientific fields. And if it's not readable in English, it's very difficult to apply it in other languages. So her work has been a bit neglected, even though Hans Vermeer has shared her most important ideas and picked them up and incorporated them. But I think for us, when we approach a professional task, it's really useful to work with the idea of the professional assignment, the contract, the contractual relations, and so on. And then, of course, the contract that is signed, or a contract that is established, has a certain service as the object, and that is the conference. That is this. You can call it a conference, you can call it a communicative event, you can call it a hypertext, more in abstract terms, but this is what the contract is about. And this is the top level, the first line of approach for our analysis of the assignment. Okay? And let me just use a couple of minutes as promised, because this is something that I'm supposed to be doing here in this talk, elaborating on this notion of the conference or the hypertext. And I'll give you also, as a bit of a shocking illustration, my original line drawing in my doctoral thesis. It's in German, so it's almost as inaccessible as Justa Holz-Mentari's book. And the idea is that the hypertext is made up, I think I can point, can I? Yes. Is made up of individual texts, individual speeches, German introduction, presentation, another presentation, whatever happens at a conference. In between, of course, there are breaks and there's conversations among all the participants. So it's a very lively, complex, communicative event. And for us as interpreters, it doesn't begin with the chairman opening the microphone, but it actually begins with the contract that we get, and then we Vorbereitung, we prepare for that assignment. We try to get access to materials, do our research, document terminology, and nowadays try to get PowerPoint slides. Sometimes these are delivered very late. In today's particular case, I apologize that the request came only yesterday, and just before I jumped on the plane, I actually sent off my PDF copy of the PowerPoint presentation, but they do arrive. thanks to modern telecommunication. And so the conference actually, our interpreting part actually begins, our work begins before the actual conference begins. And then there's a conference which is an event with a complex structure. There's not only one speech usually, but there's more to it. And if you need to use that notion of the hypertext, you will easily find in the readings that there are suggestions that there are different types of conferences, different types of assignments and meetings that you as conference interpreters will be working at. They're not clearly identifiable very often, so we speak of prototypes, typical meeting types, but some meetings are hard to classify, which is where your task comes in, and maybe you are unfortunate enough to pick an assignment for your analysis where you think it doesn't fit. Then what do? You elaborate on Pöchhacker and you create a new type, right? And you go beyond established theories and you innovate, and that can also be done. Actually, by the way, going beyond something, we all work on the foundations that have been laid by other colleagues, and as you will know, what I did in terms of conference types was based on Daniel Gilles' work on meeting prototypes in conference interpreting. Daniel Gilles, whom you all know as a doctor honoris causa of the University of Granada, that merits being mentioned and celebrated whenever we come across his name. Good, so a bow to Daniel in Paris in his well-deserved retirement. He's still active though, and as supportive as ever. So based on Gilles, I have proposed these various types of meetings, which basically go from the broadest, most complicated communicative event, think of the United Nations General Assembly, via technical conferences, specialist conferences, workshops, seminars, all the way to open fora where maybe one or two invited speakers make some presentations and then there's a discussion, to press conferences and just one-off invited lectures that you might be requested to interpret. So different types, and it's pretty obvious that they have different features or different complexities, and I think I will not even want to go into much greater detail. If you are interested, those of you who haven't been exposed to that, then we can elaborate on this after the talk, in the discussion, and say, can you share with us your understanding of a press conference, for instance. Why is a press conference a type of its own? I'm mentioning it actually because in current research on interpreting, which is very often corpus-based, in corpus-based research, it's interesting that we find two main types of corpora. He's starting again. So first he gives us conference types, you will be saying, and now he gives us corpora. Types of corpora, yes, two basic types of corpora. One is based on the European Parliament. European Parliament's plenary sittings that are available in different languages, and you can work with these recordings also for your analysis, I think. And the other, quite interestingly, but I don't think it applies to you in terms of languages, is the Chinese premiers press conferences. Have you ever heard about those? The Chinese premiers press conferences. That's a big event that always is held after the annual get-together or whatever they do there in China, in the People's Republic. And then there is a big press conference where there's consecutive interpreting very often, sometimes consecutive or also simultaneous. And many and this is recorded broadcast and can be documented. So in Europe we tend to access this corpus based on European Parliament proceedings, and in China, another superpower also in the field of translation and interpreting studies, a rising superpower, they work a lot on these publicly available recordings of the Chinese premiers' press conferences. Obviously that's in the language pair English and Chinese. And so for China, they probably is very useful to think of, this is a prototypical assignment type, and they use it a lot and they analyze it a lot. But I won't get into that. If you read publications from recent years, sometimes you find that a corpus-based study was done by analyzing recordings from such political press conferences. Very interesting research also as regards the neutrality of interpreters or lack thereof. So interesting issues that can be raised. But these are the various meeting types, and they can be characterized or need to be described by how complex they are. A General Assembly or a 2-week United Nations conference is more complex than an invited lecture or a press conference. Interesting to think of the internationalness or cultural homogeneity or lack thereof of the participants. Is this a bilateral group like Spanish experts and German experts meeting, or is this very international? How many working languages and how many cultural groups? That might be an interesting idea. How intense is this in terms of information? How much new information is delivered? And there I would make a distinction between let's say a political assembly and a technical conference on recent vaccines for a viral disease. So recent research being presented, there might be a new term in every clause that you hear, whereas if you discuss the politics of international relations and peace, you will find that I think I've heard this before, and this sounds familiar. So there are phrases, there are statements, there are some claims that keep being repeated. So that is not very high in terms of information load if you have been exposed to political meetings. So some meetings are much tougher, much more specialized, much more intensive in terms of terminology. Another interesting observation, for instance, the use of visual material. The buzzword nowadays in translation studies is multimodality. Multimodality. If I had to do this again nowadays, I would speak about the degree of multimodality of the texts being presented. There are still meetings where speakers just sit there and talk or read what they have prepared, with or without making the manuscript available to the interpreters in the booth, the reading manuscript. Or there are meetings that are presented spontaneously with lots of visuals, with audio, with video clips and images and pictures. So that makes it more multimodal and more interesting and complicated. The information flow is one of the features. Sometimes meetings are very monological, very static. And I think the Chinese premier's press conferences would also be an interesting example in that regard, because you can imagine that it's probably not very spontaneous, that the journalist cannot just stand up and says, how do you feel about this or that, and have you delivered arms to Russia or not? So these are questions that have been written down, submitted, and then they are selected, and then they get to ask the questions that have been prepared in writing beforehand. And so it's all under control, let's put it this way. So it's not very spontaneously interactive, but that might be interesting whether a communicative event has a lot of interaction, a lot of discourse that you as an interpreter cannot really prepare for very well. You never know who gets up and comes up with a strange idea or accusation or compliment or reminiscence, and things where that is not the case. So those will be features that you can use in describing such an event. That is the core of this descriptive approach when we think about the hypertext level. And one example that you will find there is a very intuitive assessment of, let's say, when we think of a technical conference, how do these features manifest themselves? I don't think I want to go into detail on this, but again, if you would like to discuss this further, then we can come back to this slide and explain in part what I've said before anyway, in terms of having more information density, having more interaction and complexity and so on. Okay, so much for the first level or first two levels. They are the assignment for the hypertext, for the conference, and then we come to the important level of the situation. And remember, now we're actually talking about context. These two terms are very closely related. One basic meaning we said of context is situational context. So at this level, what does it mean? How can it be described? And my strange proposal there is that it doesn't help to just document the time and place of something, but we want to get access to the people. Who is, think of Lastwell's formula, who is talking to whom? Who are these people? What do they want? And so my focus on understanding the situation, on analyzing the situation, is actually trying to analyze the interactant. So the core of the model of the situation is the individual interactant. The speaker, in this case would be me, the listeners, 12, 15, 17, 18 people here in the room. Who are they? What do they expect? What do they know? Where do they come from? What is their cultural background? And this is summarized in this model. So what the visible part here is usually the role. We can describe interactants in terms of their role. I am here an invited speaker, and you are here as master's students, for instance. That's, if we say that, we can characterize the situation. We know what we mean. Of course, behind these roles is also a person with their interests and passions and whatever, but there's no need in a conference-like situation to foreground this and to talk about personal or private matters. Usually we don't understand much about the person when we are in a conference setting. It's quite different, if I'm permitted this small aside, when we think of other types of interpreting beyond conferences or international organizations. In other words, community interpreting, community-based settings, for instance, healthcare settings, because if you have a doctor talking to a patient, that patient will very much appear not only in the role of patient, but really as a person, as an individual in pain or with a troubled situation. And if you engage in healthcare interpreting, this model can also be applied, I think, but it's less important to say, this is the patient role, but you get much more understanding and insight into personal matters, into the knowledge, the expectations, the troubles, the case history of an individual human being that you are interpreting for, that you are lending your voice to in communicating with the doctor. So the role and the person as the visible foreground, as it were, whereas there's a lot of background, and this is the cognitive background that I'm sketching here. It says socioculture. It just means that whatever we know, our knowledge, what we know about the world, the languages that we know, the competences that we have, whatever we can do, that's all part of our socialization. So it's our socioculturally shaped knowledge and competence that determines what we can do in a situation. I'm not analyzing the present situation, but I'm assuming that if you are students in the master's course with Spanish as an A language, you may have been socialized into Spanish culture with certain knowledge that you have that I wouldn't have, because we come from different cultural backgrounds. So this is a way of understanding who is part of the situation. And that model of the interactant must be applied to everybody involved, including the interpreter, I think. Okay, and then you have this prototypical constellation of at least 3 interacting parties, a speaker, a listener, and an interpreter. This would work in a dialogue interpreting situation. In a conference, you would have to multiply the listeners, of course. So this model, let's describe the situation in terms of the role, what we know about the person, the socio-cultural background knowledge, education, expectations, and so on. Let me go back briefly, because it also talks about what is the perspective of these individuals on the situation. How do they assess what's going on? What do they expect? What is their intention? What do they want? And those are maybe useful questions to ask, especially within a functionalist framework. What does the speaker want to do? In this case, today, I've tried to make it explicit what my intention is, what my goal is for the communication. This is not always the case. So the speaker has some intentions, some goals in communication, but you as an audience also have some hopes or expectations of what you might get out of participating in this event. Okay, so this is the level of the situation, and then only then do we approach the level of the text. This complex, multimodal something that is the material substrate of our communication. So verbal expressions, some images, illustrations, paraverbal features, gestures. Some speakers use a lot of gestures, and all of that hangs together and forms a complex unit that we call text. So when we speak of text, I hope that's also something we can agree on. We should go beyond the verbal information and think of a text as some multimodal gestalt, as my colleague Klaus Keindl in Vienna said in his work on opera translation and comic book translation, that the text is always a multimodal gestalt where different components and different parts come together and interrelate. And this is very much true also of conference interpreting. I think we have come to know this and accept this, but when you look back at some of the early definitions of simultaneous interpreting in the 1970s, for instance, even by a renowned researcher like David Gerver, the psychologist who was a pioneer in our field, he defined simultaneous interpreting as verbal information processing. Verbal information processing. So this was back then still a very narrow view. So whatever you can hear and transcribe, this is what you need to deal with in interpreting. Only the words and nothing else. And now we are seeing this task much more comprehensively, including nonverbal communication or multimodal components. Yes. There's also an illustration on that. I don't think we'll look at it in detail. It basically means that there's something that you hear and something that you see, different parts, and they hang together. The gesture you see, my verbal expression and paraverbal features, the sighs and whatever, the clearing of throat, all of that, my hesitation, my filled pauses that you hear, and other things you perceive, and it all interrelates into a whole, into a gestalt that you have as a source text. And that gives us this multi-level analytical framework that is, to summarize, that is based on or starts from top to bottom, starts from the functionalist translation theory, or as Justa Holzmenteri calls it, the theory of translatorial action. And then our focus as conference interpreters is the conference as a communicative event that we work for. Within that conference, there's always a particular situation. Of course, the situation changes from speech to speech, and within a speech, it's not something static that stays the same for 2 weeks of a meeting, or even for, some people might leave the audience, when some people might come in, and the situation is of course dynamic and is a kind of a snapshot. At a certain moment in time, we have a certain constellation of interactants. And it's only then, when we know that text, that we should ask questions like, how would we translate that? How would we interpret this sentence? How would we interpret this element? And what strategy do we have if we hear a word that we cannot interpret or understand? Should we leave it out? Should we paraphrase it? And this is where the micro level interpreting decisions come into play. It's part of, the decision needs to be based on what is the speaker trying to do, what is the function of the text, what is the overall function of the conference, the scopus of the conference, and what is my role, what is my ethical responsibility as a professional service provider? What did I promise to do when I said I will be interpreting at that conference? So these ellipses there on the left-hand side are the functional components, as it were. So let me end by kind of giving you the solution to this puzzle. The sentences were extracted from a United Nations conference of the Vienna-based Office for Outer Space Affairs. Some of you may have guessed right if you listened closely. The word space and space was used, but it's actually difficult. Space is a very general term, and it's not that easy to guess immediately that this has to do with outer space. And this is, to be precise, something that I worked on in a research project, so this is something that's happening a lot, and even as we speak, a subcommittee of this organization is meeting in Vienna, and some colleagues are working there. This was the 59th session, a 2-week United Nations conference. This is happened to pick the Spanish agenda. So when you prepare for this conference, when you're contracted to work in the Spanish booth, you get this agenda, and then you get a rough idea of the complexity of that hypertext. It's not just somebody will be giving a speech, but they will be doing different things, maybe taking votes and having an election, discussing previous reports. Where are the previous reports? Can I get them? Can I prepare them? It all is very interesting, and it's reflected here in this conference agenda. In terms of situation, this is what the situation is like when you're flown to Vienna to work in the United Nations Spanish booth. This is the conference building, the C building at UNOF, and this is what the meeting room looks like. This is what your booth is like, the Spanish booth. And if you then work on a certain day, you see the specific agenda, and for instance, you will see under item 5 of the agenda, there was a presentation. And we'll come back briefly now to that statement.
Señor Presidente, Costa Rica apoya firmemente el proceso de establecimiento de directrices de sostenibilidad a largo plazo de las actividades espaciales. Consideramos que para que las futuras generaciones puedan disfrutar del espacio, es fundamental preservarlo exclusivamente con fines pacíficos.
And then at a conference, what you would hear as a part of the linguistic context is this. No, sorry, we've heard this before. Sorry. No.
Thank the distinguished representative of Costa Rica for the statement. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Johannes Andreasen, the distinguished representative of Sweden. Sir, you have the floor.
Okay, so you get an introduction, the next speaker.
And thank the distinguished.
Yeah.
We remain at the forefront of developments with a capable space industry, cutting-edge research, and the Space Center S-Range in the northern parts of Sweden.
See? So you might have heard it the first time around. I don't think I could have picked up S-range and understood what it means. It could be S-range, and range can be something. So I don't think I would, without any context, without any multimodal visual illustration, I would have been able to translate that statement that we initially heard. But then let's imagine that the speaker used a slide presentation about the Swedish space activities, showing the slide and talking about the S-range facility. It's such a difference. We know the context, we know it's about Sweden, we know this looks like Sweden, and then we have a slide visualizing the term that we may have trouble understanding. And the visual perception helps us process that. Without the visual perception, we might even be forced to leave this out and gloss over it because we cannot be sure what we understood. So this is kind of a practical illustration using some materials from a professional assignment at the United Nations, why we have all these contextual levels, the situational extra-linguistic context, but also the immediate multimodal context, not only other linguistic parts, what has been said before in the meeting, like the chairman's introduction, but also the visual components of the speech that are part of the textual context, as it were. It's not a linguistic context, even though S-range is a word in the language. So linguistic, multimodal context. Yes, brings me to my conclusions. I've been speaking long enough. I'm sorry to keep you focused for so long. So we've seen that context is a useful notion, even though we have either been using it too much without thinking too much about it, or when we use it, we need to define it, and we say there's a broader level and a more specific level. And it's interesting to apply this notion in interpreting because it's very rich. It has a lot to do with the situation and the on-site performance, whereas in translation, I think context works differently, but I'll be discussing this with my colleague at the workshop tomorrow. So we've modeled it at different levels: the institution, the hypertext as the communicative event, especially the situation, and at the level of the textual components. And as a final outlook that I promised, this is still on-site communication, and the big word, as you know, is now going remote. Increasingly, conference interpreting also happens in remote mode using video conferencing technology, and their visibility and the situation are not so easily grasped because they happen in different places. You as an interpreter are in one kind of situation that you really, like Kirchhoff anticipated, you're not sharing their situation. They sit in a conference hall and you sit at home or in a hub and do your interpreting. So you actually end up, it's almost prophetic what Kirchhoff said in her yellow markings there, that you as an interpreter are not part of the shared communicative situation. So this is to be thought about, and the constraints that you have in remote interpreting when you have a more complex situational context. And with that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.